the one who breaks the darkness with a liberating light. Praise the one who frees the prisoners, turning blindness into sight.
Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews.
Today, Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Again I saw all the oppressions that are done under the sun, and behold the tears of the oppressed, and they had no one to comfort them. On the side of their oppressors there was power, and there was no one to comfort them. And I thought the dead who are already dead more fortunate than the living who are still alive. But better than both is he who has not yet been and has not seen the evil deeds that are done under the sun. Then I saw all the toil and all skill and work come from a man's envy of his neighbor. This also is vanity, and a striving after wind. The fool folds his hands and eats his own flesh. Better is a handful of quietness than 2 hands full of toil and striving after wind. Again I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, "For whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure?" This also is vanity, and an unhappy business. 2 are better than 1, because they have a good reward for their toil. For if they fall, one will lift up his fellow. But woe to him who is alone when he falls, and has not another to lift him up. Again, if 2 lie together, they keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? And though a man might prevail against one who is alone, 2 will withstand him. A 3-fold cord is not quickly broken. Better was a poor and wise youth than an old and foolish king who no longer knew how to take advice. For he went from prison to the throne, though in his own kingdom he had been born poor. I saw all the living who move about under the sun, along with that youth who was to stand in the king's place. There was no end of all the people, all of whom he led. Yet those who come later will not rejoice in him. Surely this also is vanity, and a striving after wind. Solomon continues to relay to us basically the worthlessness, the meaninglessness of seeking after ourselves, after our own desires, whatever it is that our heart is longing for. He starts this section with the idea of oppression. What are we oppressed by? We usually list those, thanks to Luther's theology, as 3 things. We are oppressed by sin, death, and the devil. We also talk sometimes about suffering in that place as well. Who is it that redeems us? Who is it that rescues us from all of these things? And it is Christ the Lord. We have a pitting of loneliness here against companionship. So you get loneliness already in verses 1 through 3, this idea that they have no one to comfort them. And you see it again down in verses 7 and 8 with the man who doesn't really know why he's doing all that he's doing. And then in verse 9, suddenly you get the encouragement to be in a community. And that goes through verse 12. Before we skip ahead to that section, though, let's stick in the first paragraph. Why does Solomon, question for our kids, why does Solomon say that it's better for the dead who are dead than the living who are alive? Why does he think it's better to be dead than alive? Well, the oppression is gone. The suffering is gone. The pain, the sin, it's all gone. This gets at what Paul says in Philippians 1:21, where he says, "For me to live is Christ, to die is gain." That's really an excellent verse for us to reflect on in context of this chapter. To die is gain. In our death, we get to be with Christ. Now, we'll still wait for the resurrection. We won't quite have reached it yet. We won't be in our glorified body, and the body and soul will be momentarily separated. But we would be with Christ, and that is a wonderful thing, and it is indeed gain. But we can't discount the first part of the sentence. To live is Christ. And that's going to stand in contrast really to this whole chapter, where we don't see the reason behind why man does what he does. In fact, all we see is the sinful reasoning. For example, in verse 4, all of our toil, all of our skill come from trying our envy of our neighbor. It's the old phrase, trying to keep up with the Joneses. You see the neighbor next door, they've got this cool new toy, or they've got this nice new car. I want that. How can I get that for myself? How can I get that for my family? And that coveting nature of ours, which is a breaking of a commandment, it does push us forward. There is some insight in that. But again, the contrast. It's a question I was going to say. Down in verse 8, where we see the question that the man never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? We should ask our children. This should be a regular conversation, even with ourselves. Why do we do what we do? Why do you get up in the morning? Why do you serve your family? Why do you go to the job that you go to? If these answers end up reflecting and sounding an awful lot like this chapter, it may be a good time to reconsider things in your life, especially priorities. But if you can answer as Paul did, that to live as Christ, that you do the things that you do in order to serve your neighbor, to love God and to love your neighbor, that's the proper direction of things. That's the purpose we see Jesus give to us in the New Testament. It's the purpose God gave to us when he first created us. Adam and Eve were placed on this earth to care for it and to care for one another. It's not about stuff. It's about loving one another, serving one another. And this is a good thing. Verse 5 probably sounds a little odd. Maybe the best way to say this is that the foolish person basically is wasting away. They're rotting, they're wasting their life, they're consuming themselves with that sinful attitude of theirs. Instead of seeking to serve another, they're just bringing about harm to themselves. Verse 6 again kind of reflects that. It pits quietness in the simple life against striving. Solomon, who strived for it all and had it all, here acknowledging it may well be better to just be quiet and enjoy that peace, that stillness. Verses 9 through 12 again stress this idea of community. And that goes back to Genesis 2:18. God did not make man to be alone. Even when the rest of creation was good and there was nothing yet in creation that was bad, there was this one thing that was not good. It is not good for man to be alone. Loneliness is a real problem. It's an epidemic among us. God did not make us this way. So to be together, to have people that we're close to, that we work with, that we can be with on a daily basis, is in this illustration here, this doesn't have to be a spouse. This isn't talking about that kind of companionship. This is talking about the love between brothers or good friends, these solid bonds that many people have, but some of us don't. Verse 12, the threefold cord. I'm starting to see this get a little play in weddings, as the husband and wife, instead of doing a unity candle, they'll bring up these three rope strands and they'll actually take the time to braid those together, and then they will hang them in their home in the shape of a cross as an ongoing reminder that it is husband and wife together as one, but they're not alone, that Christ is there with them. So it would actually be in proper order Christ, husband, wife, in that picture. So I'm not going to say it's common. I've seen it done once, but I'm also seeing it on the internet get a little more attention than that today. I still like the symbolism of the unity candle as the two flames are merged together into one flame. You cannot separate those flames from one another again. I mean, you could make two flames out of the one, but you could not rip the flames apart and have them be what they once were. Not possible. The sand, you could do that. It would be painful and brutal to sit there and separate grain after grain. The cords, you could unbraid them. I mean, I guess unless you fuse them somehow. That's interesting to consider. Anyway, verse 13, Solomon seems to give us in that final paragraph of the chapter some kind of an example from a life that he has seen. It's not his own. Solomon doesn't fit this description of being born poor. He was born in the king's house. He doesn't fit the description of one who's been put into prison and then ascended to a throne. So I'm not sure that we know who he's talking about, but it does. The way he phrases it, it sounds like this is somebody he actually watched, and maybe a neighboring nation. He watched the transition of a kingdom. Either way, it's all vanity, striving after wind. So seek Christ. Don't seek after the things of this world for yourself, but instead love your neighbor.
Let us praise the Word incarnate, Christ who suffered in our place. Jesus died and rose victorious, that we may know God by grace. Let us sing for joy and gladness, seeing what our God has done. Let us praise the true Redeemer, praise the one